Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video of myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update, the second part thereof for the 3rd of September 2025. We're going to start talking about Ukraine, we're going to talk about Georgia, we're going to talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, that's going to take up a fair bit, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the US at the end, and in between, going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the UK, some crazy stuff going on over here as well. So, wow, lots to get through. It's not all completely connected to Ukraine, but if we get some understanding of what's going on in these different areas of the world, we can understand where the political ebbs and flows are taking place, why they're taking place, and where that might leave these countries with regard to supporting Ukraine going forward. Okay, we're going to start with returning to the Mercator map, the interpretation of our globe in 2 dimensions. And just to remind you that we do get skewed in terms of how we understand Russia. Russia's biggest ally is the Mercator projection. Seriously, this has done a lot of work for Russia to plant an irrational fear and awe of Russia into Western brains. Russia is not as big, important, or powerful as it lies to be, neither literally nor metaphorically. And actually, you know, that is the case in terms of how I think Trump understands Russia. He keeps talking about it being that much bigger than Ukraine. I previously showed you a Mercator projection interpretation mapping tool. Let's see if I can find that. Now, I found that, and I have to say that the reason I wanted to go to this other one is because I'm fairly sure that is not an accurate representation either. That is making Russia smaller than it is. So this is the tool, and it's really cool. It's called thetruesize.com, and you can go and find any country and then move it around the world. The closer you get to the equator, the smaller it's going to get, because remember, you know, just understand how turning a 3D map into a 2D map, what that does, you have to expand, and then it just doesn't work so well. So I showed you this last time I did a whole segment on this, but the reality is when you move Russia down to Africa, it looks a lot smaller. I mean, it's bigger than the map we're looking at here. It does stretch across the entirety of northern Africa and goes into the Middle East, but you get the point, is that it is considerably smaller. And so we think that Russia is this absolutely gargantuan country, and it is big, but you know, it's not quite as big as you thought it was. And the same with the United States. You take that as a country and you bring it down to the equator, and it looks a lot smaller. Greenland was another one that is fascinating. You think it's massive, and it is, of course, the biggest island in the world, but you take it down to Africa and it's like, oh, okay, no, that's not quite as big as I thought it was. And so, yeah, that is the Mercator projection, and we need to be aware of that when we have this sense of how big it is compared to, say, and we talk about Russia here, say Ukraine. So if we take Ukraine, and that is somewhat to the south of Russia, you take that down, you know, it is still a lot smaller than Russia, but actually also a lot smaller than Libya. So there you go. These things skew our understanding of the world. Right, Zelensky has arrived in Denmark for talks with the leaders of Nordic and Baltic states. He's scheduled to meet Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen. In fact, they've already had, I think, their press statements. There's some more work going on between the defense industries of the two countries, and that's pretty important. So I will give you the details of that in my next military aid update. At the same time, UK Defence Secretary John Healey, I've got a lot of time for him. I think he's really good. He's arrived in Kiev 1 week ahead of the next Ramstein format meeting. He was welcomed by the Minister of Defence, Dennis Shmyhal, the former Prime Minister, of course. So hopefully they are going to be working together on UK support for Ukraine going forward. Interesting map here from the British IISS Institute has prepared, as it shows, well, the infographic shows Russian sabotage in Europe from between 2018 and 2025. And look how much Russia has got involved in attacking elements of each of the nations inside Europe. They're quite incredible. So, you know, when we see Friedrich Merz talk about who are the bad guys here, that's what we need to remind ourselves of, this kind of map and the activities of the Russians. So German Chancellor Merz called Putin, quite possibly, the most serious war criminal of our time, stressing there can be no leniency in dealing with war criminals. Absolutely 100%. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about oil. And of course, we've had the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting between all of these ne'er do well nations. And there has no doubt, it is definitely true that they've been discussing oil and gas, because indeed the Siberia 2 pipeline has been resurrected, and China has now agreed to the Siberia 2 gas pipeline that's going to pump something like 50 billion cubic meters a year through Mongolia from Russia to China. That was off the cards previously. It's now back on the cards. That gives you an indication of what has happened geopolitically. The US, with regard to Modi in particular, has pushed these nations further together. Now, I know there are some of you who will continue to argue that don't worry about BRICS, don't worry about the SCO, don't worry about these countries. India doesn't really like China, China doesn't like India, India doesn't like Russia, Russia doesn't like India, China doesn't like Russia, Russia doesn't like, etc., etc. None of them really like each other. It's a marriage of convenience. However, they like each other more presently than they have done for the last 7 years or something. So there is a movement that is definitely not good news for the American hegemon and for the Western world. Now, wonder why Modi and Putin are so close, says No Reports. Russia is now offering India a $3 to $4 discount per barrel on Urals crude versus Brent crude, up from just $1 in July, as US pressure mounts to curb Moscow's energy exports. So Russian oil gets cheaper for India there in response to what the US is saying. And then we have Anton Gerashenko saying Russian Gazprom has signed an agreement to build the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline to China via Mongolia. Gazprom also agreed to deliver more gas to China through 2 other routes, the existing Power of Siberia pipeline and the Far Eastern Link, planned to start working in 2027. So China will become more and more important in terms of Russia's hydrocarbon exports. So where Europe has turned off Russian gas, China is turning it on, and therefore Russia might not be in as bad a position as otherwise they might have been. And at the same time, Russia is trying to influence European leaders. So Robert Fico from Slovakia has gone to the SCO, met with Putin. Putin has called on Fico to cut Ukraine's reserve gas electricity supplies from Europe. In other words, cut stuff going back to Ukraine. Putin's asking Slovakia to do that. Fico cut off their reverse gas supplies, cut off their electricity supplies, and they will immediately understand that there are limits to their behavior in violating the interests of others, said Putin. Absolutely incendiary rhetoric in my books, and just shows who Slovakia are favouring at the moment. I just get really worried that the state of world geopolitics at the moment is that immigration is becoming this issue within Europe, and it will continue to be. I've just seen the latest stats for AfD in Germany. They are now ahead of CSU quite comfortably, and if you put them together with maybe the Linke, but particularly BSW and others, then there is a real appetite for pro-Russian thinking in Germany. You see Rassemblement National in France. You see Reform UK in the UK doing incredibly well. And while some of those supporters might not be pro-Russian, the ability for Reform UK in the UK to be manipulated by Putin is far greater than the Tories or the Labour Party. So, I am deeply worried about the direction of travel for Europe and for America. The USA has just it's all over the shop at the moment. Now, Saudi Arabia and Iraq have stopped supplying oil to India's Nayara energy refinery, which is controlled by Rosneft, the Russian concern. So the reason is EU sanctions introduced in July, and this is where the EU is important. The plant usually received about 3 million barrels per month from Saudi Arabia and Iraq, but deliveries dropped to zero in August. The company processes around 8% of India's oil and has already cut output at its Vadinar refinery to 70 to 80% due to sales problems. To export fuel, it now has to rely on the shadow fleet as major shipping companies have refused to cooperate. All happening in the oil and gas sectors. Denmark, holding the presidency for the EU, is proposing to close another loophole for Russian fuel. It's to ensure countries cannot resell oil or gas from the terrorist state to the EU, such as India has been doing. This is something the US has been talking about as well. So India refine the crude oil and then sell the refined products onto Europe, and I think that's what they're referring to. I'd said previously that's not so much of a problem because most of the value of that is added by India, and Russia are selling cheap, and necessarily cheap because no one else would buy it, so they have to sell it cheap to India. India then can command a really good price for India, and that's obviously a bad price for Russia. They are selling crude oil at a knockdown price to India. India then sells it on. The problem is if you and this is the premise of the oil price cap, if you cut Russian supply off from the world, then it will cause massive energy inflation. So you don't want to cut it off, but you want Russia to be selling it at not a high price. And actually that's what's happening with India. So if we buy Russian oil that's been refined by India at knockdown prices, then India is the one making most of the money out of that. So I don't have too much of an issue with this, but I know the US does, and possibly because they want to be selling refined products themselves. I don't know how it works there, but the EU's looking into that. They're considering tighter rules to block Russian gas after 2027 when there is a ban in place. According to Bloomberg, the plan specifically raises concerns over gas shipped through Turkstream, the pipeline linking Russia with Southeast Europe. So Turkey could have come under the magnifying glass there. Now, the UK is set to unveil new sanctions against individuals profiting from Russian oil, according to the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. The move comes as the EU considers secondary sanctions on countries helping Moscow evade restrictions. We then have, moving off oil and hydrocarbons, Erdogan, the Turkish leader, admitting that Zelensky and Putin are still not yet ready for direct talks after over 3 years of war. Turkey keeps pushing diplomacy while lower level negotiations show little progress toward ending the conflict, says the Euromaidan press. Meanwhile, there is talk about, what Trump is doing. Here is a pretty interesting interaction between Abby Phillips. I like Abby Phillip. Sorry, not Phillips, Philip. I think she's a pretty good, robust host. Here we've got Anna Kasparian. Is that I don't know there. You've got Scott Jennings, who's a diehard Trumpist. And you've got Ben Shapiro, who's in this weird position now where he's being more and more supportive of Ukraine, more and more critical of the US government's approach to Russia, but actually still a pro-Trump guy. So this is an interesting interaction.
But Scott, who could have guessed that Vladimir Putin was not serious about peace with Ukraine and that this summit was not going to produce the results that you and Trump thought it would?
Well, I think he thought he should try. The alternative was not to try, so he tried. And now Putin is doing what, many people thought was possible, which is not be serious, not follow through on the commitments they thought he made in Alaska and some follow-up phone calls when they had the Europeans at the White House. So,
just to translate his approach is to say, well, he tried, and we should congratulate him for trying, and now Putin is doing what people thought he could do. No. Putin is doing what everyone else thought he definitely would do. Like, that was always Putin's position. Putin is playing for time. Trump was played by Putin, and Putin has gained that time, and he's manipulated Trump in the meantime, in the process. So this is a really charitable interpretation. Don't get sucked in by, well, he should have tried. Like, that is Trump fundamentally misunderstanding Russia and fundamentally misunderstanding Vladimir Putin.
Look, I tend to be somebody who thinks it's worth trying to create peace deals.
It was entirely predictable. I think this is...
Thank you, Philip. That is the right thing to say. Like, no. It was entirely predictable. We're all saying this. Trump was played.
Is the problem. Everybody knew that this was what Putin was going to do. They said so from the
Yes.
get-go.
Yes.
The only people saying that Trump was a genius and that this was going to be all totally different were folks like you two and Donald Trump, perhaps.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I'm not sure that even President Trump said things were going to be totally different. He said that he was giving the opportunity for things to be totally different. But let's be real about this. 6 months ago, everybody would have celebrated on the left and in the center and on my part of the right if President Trump had said, we're going to maintain arms shipments to Ukraine and we might consider further sanctions on Russia. And actually, we're not going to force Ukraine into a bad settlement. Okay, so Trump hasn't done any of the things that everybody thought he was going to do in January of 2025. And now we're ripping him for what, not being hawkish.
So now Ben Shapiro is basically saying, well, Trump's not been as bad as what some people said, so we should celebrate that. Like, he hasn't, completely gone nuts on Ukraine, and he is selling arms to Ukraine. So, congratulating him for not being so bad is not nearly as good as congratulating him for being actually good.
Enough. It's kind of funny how the goalposts move every time Trump moves. Trump is heterodox, but he is responsive to reality.
I don't think the goalposts have moved, except that Trump has moved them. He said that he was going to end the war in 24 hours. That was obviously not going to happen. He also said that he didn't want to fund Ukraine, and now he's found a backdoor way to doing that by allowing the Europeans to do it. So I don't know that the
Trump is Russian tool narrative was untrue.
Trump.
No, but the Trump was a Russian tool. He was going to come in. He was going to sell out the Ukrainians. He was going to make Vladimir Zelensky give away everything, the entire store.
Well, he was kind of headed in that direction, but he pulled back. Exactly.
Anna Kasparian, and unfortunately it cuts there. But like Anna Kasparian, who's no fan of war, right? So she's your kind of more left wing, particularly when it comes to Israel and Palestine, very, very forthright. But like, she's right. Like, he was going in that direction, has pulled back, and it could still go in that direction. He flip-flops all over the place. So I think Ben Shapiro's on quite shaky ground there, even though I agree with more of what Ben Shapiro's been saying of late than I ever have done in my life. Scott Jennings is just full on, in my opinion, crackpot. So going to the SCO, we have had this meeting in Changchun where Xi Jinping and Putin and Kim Jong-un and the Iranian leader, they're all meeting, they're all having hugs and getting on like a house on fire. During his meeting with Putin, Xi Jinping spoke of the great responsibility of China and Russia as the main winner countries in World War II and firm decisiveness of the two countries in defending the outcomes of World War II and the historic truth. So it's the idea that China helped win World War II, and so did Russia. I mean, Russia were an important part of the failure of Nazi Germany in the end, and sometimes overlooked. And that's a narrative that's played by Putin big time. So he will say Russia won World War II. The Americans, like Trump says, the Americans won World War II. But the simple fact of the matter is, rather like Napoleon, if Germany hadn't opened the war up on two fronts, things could have been very, very different indeed. So, yeah, there are all sorts of reasons why World War II went in the direction it did, but obviously everyone seems to claim themselves as being the victors. Now, what has happened in the SCO has been a number of things. Geopolitically, these ne'er-do-well countries, to put it politely, have consolidated in their agreements with each other, relationships with each other, I think at the expense of Western hegemony, particularly the US. The US have been caught napping here. Trump went AWOL for a week and, all the health things, and then suddenly this has happened. This is exactly the time that he should have been projecting American strength. And instead, the Chinese have had this massive military parade that was everything Trump would have wanted and didn't get for his 250th anniversary of the American army, and the parade that he ordered, that Pete Hegseth sorted, that was an absolute dance squib compared to this. I mean, say what you like, but this was a phenomenal military parade. Yes, dictatorial. Yes, very conformist and whatnot, but it was insanely impressive in many ways and was a show of strength. So Mick Ryan, the retired Australian general, talks about it here. An initial assessment of the PLA parade that's just finished in Beijing, overall no major surprises, although there was some new equipment. The structure and content of the parade was pretty standard. 5 key themes stood out for me, however. Theme 1, most of the weapons and the platforms were not brand new, but generally every land, air and sea platform was more modern than than in the inventories of Western military organizations. Newer does not always mean better, however. While most military equipment has been tested in Iraq, Ukraine and elsewhere, none of China's new kit has. Theme 2, the new weapons and platforms were interesting and demonstrate the ongoing advanced military R&D ecosystem that China now has. The large underwater uncrewed vessels, the uncrewed rotary wing aircraft, and the HHQ-16C, DF-61 and DF-31BJ missiles, as well as the laser defense systems, were new reveals by the PLA. I thought the UAV, the drone on the back of the infantry fighting vehicle, was interesting. Long gone are the days where China was reliant on Russia or other foreign systems. The level of indigenous capacity infers high levels of sustainability in any future conflict. That's really important. So, it used to be that China would be getting weapons from Russia. That's no longer the case. They make them themselves, and that means that they can sustain their own war efforts with their massive industry. That imagine if China got onto a war footing. You don't want to go to war with China, essentially. Theme 3, parades are not indicators of war fighting effectiveness, notwithstanding the impressive orchestration of the parade and highly synchronized music and marching. These have almost zero impact on the measurement of military effectiveness. Good point there. While there have been large reforms in the past decade, particularly in the creation of joint theatre commands and strategic support institutions, space, cyber, etc., we need to watch exercises and activities such as joint swords, straight thunder around Taiwan and elsewhere to gain additional insights into real PLA capability. Theme 4, the parade was clearly designed to influence the calculus of regional government. While the demonstrations of military power is impressive, I don't think that this will shift the perspectives of regional leaders drastically. For those who have already decided to accommodate China, the parade might reinforce why they decided to do so. For others who have decided to resist Chinese aggression, it may provide additional purpose for doing so. The really interesting question is this: what was Putin thinking watching the parade, and what are his generals thinking? Surely they must be concerned. They have fought against China in the past century and has stripped out large parts of their force structure from the east to fight in Ukraine. Theme 5, Xi's narrative remains steady and consistent. In his speech, President Xi reinforced his long-standing narrative about the inevitable rise of China. He described how the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is unstoppable, and that humanity is again faced with a choice of peace or war, dialogue or confrontation, and win-win outcomes or zero-sum games. It also gave Xi another chance to reinforce loyalty to the CCP by the PLA. Thanks for reading this, etc., etc. So interesting views on some of the military aspects of the parade. Jürgen Nauditz says at the parade, China unveiled the world's most powerful laser, the LY-1, capable of shooting down all missiles and drones. On the brink of World War III, the People's Republic of China openly displays its entire arsenal. Compare this with the large military parade for Trump on his birthday. Because, of course, it was Trump's birthday as well, wasn't it? So China are flexing here, right? And this is, what we saw. This is what we saw at the American parade. So honestly, with no denigration to these individuals and whatever, but for a military parade, you can see why actually after this parade, apparently Trump was really, really angry. Because a couple of people walking with a drone held aloft, a Sherman tank driving down the road, a couple of Sherman tanks in a row there, or that is that the anyway, that's a Sherman. So that was wholly underwhelming. And then you look at this and the sheer volume and power on show there. I mean, just look at those vehicles behind.
In maritime attack and defense.
And look behind. Look at the size and scope of what was on show there was actually really impressive. So there's not the slightest doubt, says this particular source, that, and look at, you had flybys of coordinated aircraft and whatnot, and just huge bits of kit. So there's not the slightest doubt that China is preparing for a global war against the West. Meanwhile, the West continues to float in pink clouds and cultivate pacifism within its own society. So, whatever you think about like war and defense and military expenditure, like there is no doubt that China is flexing here, right? And how do you respond to that? Do you respond with making sure that you are well positioned militarily, or do you just give up on military expenditure and go, well, we're going full on pacifism, let's just let China do this? Because then, of course, all that eventually allows is China to expand territorially, which is what Russia have done with Ukraine. So if you like take weapons away from Ukraine, as we've done, we took the nuclear weapons and strategic bombers away from Ukraine, and then suddenly, not suddenly, then eventually Ukraine was invaded by Russia, who continued to cultivate those weapons, right? And then you have territorial expansionism and imperialism back on the cards. Well, will China do that if everyone else just gives up? So, how do you deal with this going forward? Now, this is how Donald Trump dealt with it, and it's a bit weird, and I don't know quite what to make of this. But this is Trump on Truth Social, actually, I think, being sarcastic, which is an unusual thing for Americans generally. The big question to be answered is whether or not President Xi of China will mention the massive amount of support and blood that the United States of America gave to China in order to help it to secure its freedom from a very unfriendly foreign invader. And he's talking about back in obviously the 20th century, World War II era, when Americans helped China, but actually it wasn't a massive amount of support and blood, comparatively speaking. So he starts off by effectively lying, really, here, and then says many Americans died in China's quest for victory and glory. Someone else points out, Arnaud Bertrand, this is peak main character syndrome. The truth is extremely few Americans, probably just a couple thousand, died in the Chinese theatre during World War II, especially when you compare it to the 20 million Chinese deaths. But yeah, many Americans died in China's quest for victory and glory, says Trump. And here's the key part. I hope that they are rightfully honoured and remembered in the bravery and sacrifice. So he's talking about this being a kind of remembrance of World War II, the whole parade. May President Xi and the wonderful people of China have a great and lasting day of celebration. Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America. That's really passive-aggressive, like sarcasm at the end there. President Donald J. Trump. Interesting, by the way, all that stuff I was saying about him being ill and out of it for the last 7 days. He ended his tweets, President DJT. He's now gone back to President Donald J. Trump. So some more evidence that he was a bit AWOL in the last 7 days. Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America. That is pretty pointed there. Now, I'm going to go to the wonderful pairing of Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, right and left, on The Rest is Politics, as they try and break down what went on in the SCO and why, what we can take from it, why it was pretty troubling, and what the US response has been, or even, indeed, how we can explain India, for example, and Modi's activities in the context of Trump asking for the Nobel Peace Prize from India.
We're in Singapore right at the moment of this extraordinary meeting which brought Modi, Xi Jinping and Putin together. So India, China and Russia together, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Give us a bit of a sense of that.
Well, I mean, I do think this meeting is very consequential. I mean, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has been going for some time. It started with mainly Russia and China and four of the stands, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, a few others. And then it's grown. And the signs are that it's growing still because some of the people who are there are not full members of the SCO, but they're there at this thing, which I think has been, I hate to say this, but it's been perfectly timed for Xi Jinping. And the absent force in this is, of course, Trump, because Modi, and I think, I'm glad to see the New York Times finally agrees with me that the real story at the heart of the India-US rupture is the Nobel Peace Prize. The fact that Pakistan has said that they would nominate Trump, and Modi was really pissed off that Trump tried to take credit, as this is one of his 10 wars it is now that he's stopped, the India-Pakistan skirmishes recently. And so Modi's there, and Modi is there very much, I think, signalling that the bipartisan American 25, 30-year effort to get Modi much more into the American orbit, he's kind of resisting that, not least because of the way that Trump has treated him. And of course, Putin, fresh from his winner-takes-all summit with Trump in Alaska, is there very much looking just like one of the big three in this new nexus. And of course, Russia, India has been tricky. India, China has been tricky, not least because of the border skirmishes that happened a few years ago and the war of the 60s. But also China, Russia is tricky. And yet Trump has seemingly brought them all together in a way that, you know, makes them look like they're definitely vying to be a rival collection to the Western alliance.
Strategically, as you're saying, the big US policy really for 20, 30 years has been to think about how to make sure that China is relatively isolated. I mean, China's seen as the US's big peer competitor, and there have been different US attempts to do this, and it went on through all these different administrations, Republican, Democrat, through to Biden.
And through Trump 1.
And through Trump 1. And the idea was, as you say, very important idea, that India, which is this enormous population and increasingly enormous economy, would remain within the Western orbit. That Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, Australia would be on the US side. And then there was another idea, which was being sold by some of the people who are in the new Trump team. So Marco Rubio seemed to talk about this, Elbridge Colby, who's a deputy defense guy, used to talk about this, of what they called a reverse Kissinger. And the idea was that in the 1970s, Nixon and Kissinger decided to isolate Russia by reaching out to China. The reverse Kissinger was going to go in the other direction. We're going to isolate China by reaching out to Russia. And there were some people who thought when Trump started taking the Russian side on Ukraine, maybe this is what he's up to. But as you say, this conference in Shenzhen shows the collapse of the entire strategy, because instead of having China isolated with Russia peeled off through Trump's charm offensive and Modi peeled off in the other direction, what's happened is they've been forced together in, I guess, one very, very fundamental way, which is increasingly those countries now see the US as a more and more aggressive, unpredictable threat. If you're China, you're thinking, is the US Navy going to stop my oil supplies coming through? If you're Russia, you really are very conscious of all the stuff that the US and the West have done against its economic system. If you're India, you're now facing 50% tariffs. And you're facing it in a way that you can't predict. I mean, I wanted to turn to you on this, because if you're Modi, you're going to be very perplexed. You would have thought that you'd done everything right. Ambani, who's the guy, the big Indian billionaire who processes the oil, had invited Jared Kushner and Trump's daughter to his wedding, and this all kind of big deal. Modi and Trump seemed to be mates. And there was a general sense that Trump was like some sort of classic kind of old-style dictator, and all you needed to do was invite the family to the wedding and give some... There are 10 Trump buildings, I think, in India, and yet none of that worked.
And that's why, you see, I think that, you have this bipartisan policy, Republican-Democrat presence, as you say, and with very little resistance, basically saying, India's going to be a future power, we've got to get them on board, etc. Trump seems to do that term one. You have these, what came across as like love-ins between the two of them, going to... I think there's 110,000 people at one of the rallies that they did together in term one. And the only thing I can think of that's caused this rift is this India-Pakistan Nobel Prize thing. 2001, America lifted sanctions on India that it imposed because of its nuclear program. 2005, it began actually negotiating a pretty generous nuclear cooperation deal signed in 2008. And then 2016, they made India a, quote, major defense partner, which meant it had access to some of the technologies without becoming a kind of fully fledged ally. So that's what's being, it would seem, being reversed. And if you think about it, the raising of the tariffs to 50%, which is going to hit their economy, and particularly small and medium-sized people, really badly. The reason that Trump gave was because of Indian increase in the buying of crude Russian oil, which is true. We've talked about this before. It went from, I think, 1% of their oil to something like a third. But China is a bigger importer of Russian.
And here's the point. So and this goes back to, well, it has to be because of the Nobel Prize thing, because if you're punishing India for buying hydrocarbons and yet China off Russia, and yet China buy more hydrocarbons off Russia, and you hadn't put those sanctions on China, you hadn't used the same reasoning with China, then it's not really about Russia, is it? It's about retribution for Nobel Prize. And then you're thinking, wow, so the whole upsetting of the whole geopolitical game of chess is over Donald Trump's fragile ego. It's astonishing. Like, it's astonishing how I think naive is the wrong word, but how kind of simplistic and just how terrible, how ignorant, I think, as well, the Trump administration's foreign policy agenda is. And I possibly because maybe they had an agenda, but they can't follow it because Trump is just being infantile in his single-minded quest for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Crude, and yet he's not gone after Xi Jinping in the same way. Or just on the business side, Peter, one of the really substantial things that I think has come out of this summit is Putin and Xi have done some sort of deal on the new Siberian pipeline. So this is about, energy from Russia to Mongolia.
And again, avoiding American ships. I
Absolutely.
mean, you're not exposed to the Navy in the sea.
And if you look at what Xi Jinping said, member states, he's talking here about the SCO, should, quote, oppose Cold War mentality, which is what we normally associate with them and Russia, bloc-based confrontation and bullying. We know, and that, by the way, he's looking at Modi when he says that, and he's talking about the tariffs, and safeguard the international system with the United Nations at its core. And if you think about that, so China is often seen by the Brits and by the Americans as the country that is most blocking anything that happens at the United Nations, and he's flipped this around.
This is something fascinating. So Xi Jinping's been trying for years to sell this line, and nobody's been listening. And Trump has suddenly made it plausible.
Yeah.
Suddenly, for the first time, China's attempt to say we represent predictability, the UN system, fair business, which seemed ridiculous 2 years ago, now seems very interesting. Second thing, on Russia, the China-Russia relationship is amazing because on the surface, people say Russia's a much smaller economy. What's China got to benefit? You've talked about oil, and there's other material things like the fact that Russia is a market for Chinese goods. But I think there's a bigger thing, which is that Russia can say things China can't. So if we take your point that China is portraying itself as the guardian of the international rules-based system, they have this mate who can go out there saying unbelievably aggressive and hostile things against the West. They have a friend in Russia who has nuclear weapons. They have a friend in Russia who has a network of allies in Africa that they can draw on and in Central Asia that they can draw on. And they have a friend who can propose things they can't propose. So Russia can say things like, we're going to create an independent payment system. We're going to get away from the old US-dominated system. And it's a very, I don't know quite how you define the relationship, but Russia is very, very useful to China.
They also do, though, have the...
And honestly, that's an absolutely great analysis, obviously, but that is so important that I think people can dismiss the relationship between Russia and China by saying, oh, they don't really get on, or Xi Jinping's in this position, or Putin's that. But actually, there is a utility for China in Russia, and Russia definitely sees a utility in China. Russia depend on China, in fact, to a worrying degree, where actually there are some in China in Russia who have long thought this, and now even more so that actually Russia has become a vassal state of China. But that's, I think, necessary for the continued existence of Russia in terms of they lose the war if it's not for China and to some degree North Korea. So North Korea and China are definitely propping up Russia at the moment, and then Russia can be very useful for China for being a kind of Chinese megaphone through a European lens, if you like. Or a white person's lens, maybe. So there are some fascinating dynamics, and you throw India into that, and India being forced towards these two other nations, and you've got a problem for the kind of Western hegemon. Now, Trump doesn't seem at all concerned about this. First of all, we're going to go to see what he said about Zelensky and Putin.
Have you spoken with President Putin in the past week? Have you spoken with President Putin?
Yeah, I don't want to. I have learned things that will be very interesting. I think in the next few days you'll find out.
Will there be any consequences if there?
So that's fascinating because he said we'll learn things in the next few days that you might find out about. Wow. Okay, so what's that? Because that suddenly sounds like he's not happy with Russia. So that would be good for Ukraine.
There isn't some type of announcement of a meeting with President Putin and President Zelensky.
Yeah, there will be. We're going to see what happens. We're going to see what they do and what happens. I'm watching it very closely.
And unfortunately, like I said this morning, it goes back to, well, we're going to see 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 week. 50 days, 10 to 12 days, 2 weeks. It never happens. We're going to see. It's completely vague and lacking of any kind of substance and use. So he says there will be consequences. If this doesn't happen, we're going to wait and see. So we're just back to Russia dictating everything. This is a weakness of Donald Trump. He is unbelievably weak as an international leader. As soon as he comes up against, he's very strong when he's bullying Canada and Mexico and Greenland, and bullying these nations. He can seem very strong. But when he comes up against people that he kind of likes, these big dictators and leaders of autocracy, he capitulates. He is weak sauce.
Last week they lost 7,000 between the two countries. 7,000.
And then he just keeps talking about the number of people that they lost and going on about that over and over again. So that is, on the one hand, there are things we learned about this, which, changes stuff type thing. And you think, that's good for Ukraine. And then it just defers to his normal positioning.
It's going to be crime-free, and it's going to be spick and span. You'll be proud of Washington again. Go ahead, please.
Sir, China's having a massive military parade that President Putin and Kim Jong-un will be attending. Do you interpret that as a challenge to the US? And are you concerned at all about those countries trying to be some sort of counterweight?
Not at all. China needs us, and I have a very good relationship with President Xi, as you know, but China needs us much more than we need them. No, I don't see that at all, no.
And that's not immediately true. If you're talking about trade deficits and whatnot, China needs, it depends which way you look at that, actually. China needs the US to buy its stuff, but the US needs China to buy cheap stuff. So, that kind of, they need us more than we need them, it's not immediately true. It's not immediately obvious that. And then what he goes on to say here is just typically Trump horrendousness.
And I had actually a very good meeting with President Putin a couple of weeks ago. We'll see if anything comes out of it. If it doesn't, we'll take a different stance.
So I get on really well with Xi Jinping, and I had a really good meeting with Putin. No, you didn't. It was a complete disaster, and Putin came out winning there. So it's this whole SCO meeting, the parade, the dynamics between those countries, and how the US has and will react is absolutely fascinating. More to see there, but Europe is absent from this discussion. What have they been doing? Is Europe a serious power to contend with? Well, Europe has its own problems because it's made up of 30 odd member states under 30 member states, and they are at the moment being interfered with by Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and also by the United States. We're going to come on to talk about this in a second. We're going to go first to Georgia, and unfortunately things are not looking good in Georgia. 19 activists were arrested yesterday. This is Luka Mishveladze. The regime continues its terror. Horrible violence happening in the streets of Tbilisi. The Russian regime is destroying Georgia. So Russia are tightening their grip on Georgia. Here we have Stratcom Center saying, since seizing control of the Georgian government last year, the Russian-backed regime in Tbilisi has now standardized all the brutalities that are innate to all Kremlin-backed kleptocracies. Today, dozens of critics were arrested. Really horrible. So this video is from Marika Mikiashvili. I've interviewed her before. It's an evergreen interview that we look at the history of what has happened in Georgia. Go and check that out. And I'll try and get hold of her and see what's happening at the moment. Right, now we're going to go to the UK, and I'm going to talk not so much about the protests and stuff. I just want to concentrate on this because Nigel Farage was not in the House of Commons for the reopening of Parliament after the summer recess. Where was he? He was in the United States. Now, Reform UK, of which he is the leader, have been talking about how women and children need to be kept safe, and these foreign grape gangs and illegal immigrants are coming in and they're endangering our children and women. They had a debate on this in Parliament. In fact, there was a statement and Nigel Farage wasn't there. In fact, not a single Reform UK parliamentarian turned up for that discussion on for the National Rape Gang inquiry. None of them turned up. They don't give a damn. Reform UK don't give a damn about the things that they claim that they are supporting. They don't care for protecting women and children. They care about one thing, immigration. And if they can use the other thing to further their agenda in terms of immigration, then they will. Now, what was Nigel Farage doing? He was in Washington, D.C. at a conference on conservatism. I wonder who paid for the flight set. In fact, it's worth knowing that Farage faces a formal complaint, and this was from earlier this year, over donations from a right-wing US PR firm. It says the globe-trotting MP for Clacton. So there are all these memes about how he was elected by Clacton, but is never in Clacton. He doesn't do surgeries for his constituents. He doesn't care about his constituency. He's just all for platforming anti-immigration and sowing division in the UK, and then going to the US to meet with similar people in the US. Taking advice from a former spokesman for the far-right agitator Steve Bannon, and he hasn't declared it as a benefit, so we've complained to Parliament, says the Good Law Project. Now, this was Keir Starmer's response yesterday to Nigel Farage, which is what I'm bringing this up for a reason here.
The honourable member for Clacton is not here representing his constituencies in the house that he was elected to. No, he's flown to America to badmouth and talk down our country. And worse than that, Mr. Speaker, if you can believe it, he's gone there to lobby the Americans to impose sanctions on this country which will harm working people.
And this is really interesting. So he really has... So Nigel Farage has gone to the US to lobby the US to sanction us, his own country, because our freedom of speech laws he thinks are too draconian, and because of Graham Linehan and his detainment at Heathrow was it yesterday. So he's going to a House Judicial Committee hearing in the US on freedom of speech. And he's gone to the US to get the US to use their trade and diplomatic influence on the UK to get us to change our laws. So he's not going to change the laws from within Parliament as a parliamentarian. No, he wants our laws to be changed by the US sanctioning us. And he's talking about fucking patriotism. Man alive. Nigel Farage can do one.
You cannot get more unpatriotic than that. It's a disgrace. Mr. Speaker, on the question of the Online Safety Act, that protects children from material on suicide, on self-harm, and online predators. And Reform say they would scrap it. When their leader was asked, well, what would you replace it with? His answer, there needs to be a tech answer. I don't know what that is. Well, you can't run a country on don't know answers.
And do you know what? Keir Starmer's pretty spot on there. Now, there is this really difficult situation at the moment where the police have arrested at Heathrow Airport the writer of the Father Ted series, who's a comedy writer, who has been, over the last however long, been quite a critic of transgender ideology as he would see it. and has written things on Twitter, and he was arrested at the airport. But because the police at our airports are armed by default, people are then saying he's been arrested by armed police and blah, blah, blah. I'm really bigging this up to be, maybe bigger than it is. And it is a big thing. And there are actually lots of people, like, I don't think this should have happened. However, this is that big discussion you have when you have freedom of speech. When does it become free speech and when does it become hate speech? And when you are inciting violence, that's when it crosses the line to you being arrested. So you don't get arrested for saying, really unsavory things until it goes into hate speech inciting violence. So this is the Daily Mail of all papers saying Mr. Farage is skipping Parliament this week, for the first week back after its summer break, including Prime Minister's questions to visit the United States, and will give evidence to the House Judiciary Committee in Washington later. He will raise the case of Linehan, who has said he was detained at Heathrow Airport over 3 posts on Twitter, on X, as he argues Britain has lost its way on civil liberties. The Sun reported. The paper said he will, that is, Farage will also urge the Trump administration to use, quote, diplomacy and trade as leverage against the UK. He is speaking at a Republican-controlled HJC session entitled Europe's Threat to American Speech and Innovation, which will, quote, highlight how European online censorship laws, specifically the United Kingdom's Online Safety Act and the European Union's Digital Services Act, threaten Americans' right to speak freely online in the United States. So I gave you a whole video recently on how the US is looking to sanction individual people in the EU who are responsible for trying to put a Digital Services Act in place that will look to regulate predominantly American, but not just, but obviously most of the big tech companies are American, activities, which is a good thing. Otherwise, we are giving all of our power to the algorithms and to the tech companies. And that then becomes tech authoritarianism, whether you have people like Peter Thiel at the heart of the American government. So good on the EU, particularly in this case, for trying to stand up to tech. Now we've got Nigel Farage going to the US and saying that the US should be reacting because those regulations in the EU and the UK are not fit for purpose. And we can have criticisms of the Online Safety Act in the UK. I don't think it was particularly well put together. But like to have our own politician go to lobby a foreign country to interfere and threaten us over these things, I think is disgusting. And for this man to claim that he is all about patriotism is absolutely not right. And when you know that he's getting money from somebody, so Nigel Farage takes more money as an MP than any other MP in the UK by a country mile. Like, he has what he's declared, and there's lots he hasn't declared. This being a point in case, and also he's not declared a fishing vessel and its crew that he's obviously getting income for, and so on and so forth. But he gets something like at least £1 million from outside MP salary stuff, and the next highest one down the list is something like £300,000. He's that much of a gap, so he makes an absolute bucket of money on stuff, and that's just what's declared. And some of it's coming from nefarious, I think, directions. And he goes abroad to try and lobby. Now, this is a problem to do. I mean, it's not a problem. Sorry. This is a prickly subject that has, caused an awful lot of ink to be spilled. So Graham Linehan, who was detained at the airport for saying things on Twitter, we don't quite know what he said because the Metropolitan Police confirmed his arrest was linked to 3 posts on Twitter, now branded as X, published in April this year. While the full text of the tweets have not been officially disclosed, the posts were described as targeting transgender people in language interpreted as inciting violence. And there's your threshold. If it incites violence, then he is inciting violence to people. Now, he's already had a long history of confrontational posts on the platform. Critics argue, says this article, his online presence has crossed into harassment, while his supporters say he is raising legitimate concerns about gender ideology. The arrest marks the first time the social media activity has resulted in direct criminal charges. It's worth noting that he is already facing criminal proceedings in relation to harassment and criminal damage charges brought by a transgender woman earlier in 2025. So, this is not the only scrape with the law he is having over this subject. But you are going to have free speech advocates going nuts about this guy being detained, and you're going to have defenders of that detention saying, well, actually, he's crossed the line into inciting violence. I can't cast an opinion because I don't know what he said. So I just sit there going, it looks a bit officious, it looks a bit draconian, but I'm going to hold my judgment until I know what was said. But then you get people that are trying to attack the Labour government for this, when actually it's the police following the existing laws. Right, the Labour government didn't ask for Graham Linehan to be arrested, but that's what you will see. So you have seen now Keir Starmer being attacked over this, and that's not quite fair, I would say. Now, just in terms of, you know, all of this narrative at the moment that immigrants are swarming our shores and boat people, I've been responding to comments in my thread saying, you know, I can't believe your opinions on this. It's all about boat people. I'm like, boat people are a relatively small proportion of total immigration, legal immigration. If you've got a problem with immigration, it's probably more justified in terms of legal immigration. But then you talk about inflation and all these other, and the economy, and it becomes really complex. And my conclusion about immigration debates are, it's freaking complicated. But amid all the stuff about dangerous London and broken Britain, says the iconic reporter John Simpson, new figures show the homicide rate in London is at a 10-year low. Killings have dropped by 26% over the last year. So, you know, but last year's Labour, so it's probably going to be from long-term things put in place. But you could build a case, or like, well, Labour have done a good job of bringing serious crime down. From 78 to 58. No one under 25 was murdered during the school summer holidays. I mean, that should be seen as a success, but no, because it's all about controlling the narrative here. Now, I'm going to get back to this thing about Nigel Farage and freedom of speech, because this is a problem. Going to the US to try and undermine our political landscape, laws, policies and whatnot, I think is dodgy. But if you're going to talk about how wonderful freedom of speech is, like, be aware that your Nottinghamshire council has, the Reform County Council has banned local journalists from interviewing them. There's no freedom of speech there at all. Like, Reform don't give a damn about freedom of speech. Richard Tice hates scrutiny. Reform UK is so fragile. Reform, quote, don't have to talk to press acting as activists, said Richard Tice after this media ban. So his response to there being a media ban up at Nottinghamshire County Council, you know, Reform Council boss bans local newspapers' reporters. He's like, we don't have to talk to the press acting as activists. But of course, you know, you can't on the one hand be shouting for freedom of speech over here, and on the other hand, shutting it down over there. Now, Nick Clegg was our former Deputy Prime Minister. He was a Lib Dem. When the Lib Dem went into coalition with the Conservatives back in, 2010 time, you had Nick Clegg as a Deputy MP, and I quite like Nick Clegg. They got done over tuition fees. But anyway, he came out and then worked for Facebook, and then left Facebook because Facebook started going, I think, a bit too Trumpy. And Nick Clegg was on Newsnight the other night saying this.
Because on the one hand, I cannot stand the rank hypocrisy of senior American politicians from the right flying first class or by private jet over to the United Kingdom and declaring that somehow there is excessive censorship in the UK, and then flying back to the US to basically intimidate and bully and cow their own opponents in a way which I think is flagrantly contrary to American principles of free expression. So I really can't bear the double standards.
J.D. Vance
I can conclude them all. I think it's an outrageous example of sort of double standards. Having said all of that, I also think we need to be mindful in this country. I mean, I think I saw in the report, and maybe it was in The Economist recently, that the police are now arresting 30 people a day for online speech offences, many of those arrests taking place based on powers which even, from the statute book that even preceded the existence of the internet. I do worry that we're maybe getting the balance wrong in this country in the following way. Firstly, that maybe we are being over-censorious to speech that is offensive, unpleasant, vile. But, guess what? And part of the definitions of living in a free society is that you can say things that are offensive and other people violently disagree with, whilst at the same time, oddly enough, not going far enough, in my view, on protecting children by implementing properly, workable, watertight age verification requirements.
That to me seems pretty sensible. So Nick Clegg but the problem is always going to come down to incitement to violence. And if you cross the line into incitement to violence, and that can be subjective, that line is subjective. Is that inciting violence or not? Was it tongue in cheek or not? Did you mean, that's where it becomes hate speech that's inciting violence, and that becomes that's the crime bit. These things are difficult. And I think Nick Clegg was correct in calling out the Americans for their rank hypocrisy. And by the Americans, I mean people like J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio and others who have come over and made these claims. And indeed people like Nigel Farage. But there are issues, I think, that need to be tightened up. Right, I was going to talk about US politics. I don't have time to now. Anyway, that's a little trip through Ukrainian-related topics, but also going into the UK and freedom of speech as well. So, hey, why not? Take care. Speak soon.